The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone square of Millbrook, a small town nestled in the Virginia countryside during the year 1847. The air hung thick with tension as townspeople gathered in hushed clusters, their voices carrying whispers of judgment and fear. At the center of their attention stood a makeshift wooden frame, crude and threatening in its simplicity. Elena Moreau pressed herself against the cool brick wall of the general store, her heart pounding so hard she feared it might give her away. Her olive skin and dark curls, inherited from her Spanish mother and Irish father, had always marked her as different in this predominantly white settlement. But today, that difference had become her curse. 3 days earlier, Elena had been working as a seamstress in the town's only dress shop, quietly earning her living while trying to remain invisible. Her employer, Mrs. Catherine Hartwell, had been kind enough to overlook the whispered rumors about Elena's mixed heritage. In a time when such ancestry was viewed with suspicion and hostility, Elena had learned to keep her head down and her voice quiet. The trouble began when Thomas Blackwood, the sheriff's son and the town's most eligible bachelor, had begun paying attention to her. Thomas was handsome, with sandy hair and kind blue eyes that seemed to see past the color of her skin to the person beneath. He would linger at the dress shop, making conversation about fabric and fashion, but Elena knew he was really there to see her. Their friendship had bloomed in secret meetings by the old oak tree behind the church, where Thomas would bring her books, and they would talk about dreams of traveling to places where a person's worth wasn't measured by the color of their skin or the purity of their bloodline. Elena had dared to hope that perhaps love could triumph over prejudice. But love, Elena learned, was a luxury that society would not permit her to enjoy. Mrs. Margaret Caldwell, the sheriff's wife and the town's self-appointed moral guardian, had witnessed one of their secret meetings. Her sharp eyes had caught the tender moment when Thomas had taken Elena's hand, and her cruel heart had immediately begun plotting revenge against what she saw as an abomination. The accusation came swift and merciless. Mrs. Caldwell claimed that Elena had used witchcraft to bewitch Thomas, that her mixed blood carried evil powers passed down from her foreign mother. In a town where superstition ran as deep as prejudice, such accusations carried deadly weight. Sheriff Caldwell, a man more concerned with keeping his wife happy than with seeking truth, had arrested Elena without investigation. The trial, if it could be called that, lasted less than an hour. The judge, heavily influenced by the town's leading families, declared Elena guilty of corrupting a white man through supernatural means. The punishment was designed to humiliate as much as to harm. Elena would be hung upside down from the wooden frame in the town square, displayed like a warning to any other person of mixed race who might dare to dream beyond their supposed station. The position would cause blood to rush to her head, creating disorientation and eventual unconsciousness, while the public display would serve as entertainment for those who believed themselves morally superior. As Elena watched the final preparations being made to the terrible apparatus, she thought of her parents. Her mother, Isabella, had died when Elena was 12, but not before teaching her daughter to be proud of her heritage. Her father, Patrick, had disappeared 2 years later, leaving Elena to fend for herself in a world that saw her as neither fully one thing nor another. The crowd grew larger as word spread through the town. Children were lifted onto their fathers' shoulders to get a better view of the spectacle. Women clutched their shawls tighter and whispered prayers, though whether for Elena's soul or for protection from her supposed evil, Elena could not tell. Thomas stood among the crowd, his face pale and his hands clenched into fists. Elena could see the anguish in his eyes, the war between his desire to help her and his fear of the consequences. She understood his paralysis. To speak out would mean social exile, possibly worse. His family's position in the town depended on maintaining the appearance of propriety. Sheriff Caldwell stepped forward, unrolling a scroll that contained Elena's sentence. His voice boomed across the square as he read the charges and the punishment. The words felt like physical blows to Elena, each accusation cutting deeper than the last. Two of the sheriff's deputies approached Elena with rough hands and cruel smiles. They had volunteered for this duty, eager to participate in what they saw as righteous justice. Elena tried to maintain her dignity as they dragged her toward the wooden frame. But fear made her legs weak and unsteady. The rope was coarse against her ankles as they bound her feet to the wooden beam. Elena closed her eyes and tried to think of her mother's gentle voice singing Spanish lullabies, of her father's laugh echoing through their small cabin, of Thomas's kind eyes looking at her with respect and affection. As they prepared to hoist her into position, Elena whispered a prayer not for rescue, but for strength to endure whatever came next with grace. She would not give these people the satisfaction of seeing her break completely. The wooden frame groaned as the ropes were pulled tight, lifting Elena's feet into the air and leaving her hanging in the humiliating position decreed by the town's justice. Blood began to rush to her head, creating a dizzy, disorienting sensation that made the faces in the crowd blur together into a mass of cruel humanity. Thomas stepped forward then, his face set with determination that surprised even Elena. But before he could speak, Sheriff Caldwell raised his hand in warning, and Thomas stopped, the weight of social pressure holding him back like invisible chains. Elena hung there, a symbol of everything the town feared and hated, while the crowd watched and waited to see how long it would take for her spirit to break completely. The sun climbed higher in the sky as Elena hung from the wooden frame, her vision swimming with each passing minute. The blood rushing to her head created a pounding rhythm that matched the jeering voices of the crowd below. Some townspeople had begun to drift away, their appetite for cruelty satisfied. But others remained to witness what they believed would be Elena's eventual collapse. Thomas Blackwood stood at the edge of the square, his internal battle raging as fiercely as any war. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to act, to tear Elena down from that horrible contraption and carry her to safety. But the weight of his family's expectations, his position in society, and the very real threat of becoming an outcast himself held him frozen in place. It was his younger sister, Mary, who finally broke through his paralysis. The 16-year-old girl appeared at his elbow, her green eyes blazing with indignation that matched his own. Mary had always been different from the other girls in town, more interested in books than gossip, more concerned with justice than social standing. "How can you just stand there?" "Thomas," Mary whispered urgently, her voice cutting through the noise of the crowd. "You told me you loved her. You said she was kind and intelligent and good. Are those just words, or do they mean something?" Thomas looked down at his sister, seeing in her young face the moral clarity that he had somehow lost in the maze of social expectations. "Mary, you don't understand. If I interfere, I'll lose everything. Father will disown me. The town will exile me. I'll have nothing to offer Elena, nothing to protect her with." Mary's response was swift and sharp. "And what will you have if you let her die while you stand here counting the cost of doing what's right? You'll have your precious position in a town full of people who hung an innocent woman upside down for falling in love with you. Is that really what you want to preserve?" Her words hit Thomas like a physical blow. He realized that he had been thinking like a coward, calculating profit and loss, when the only calculation that mattered was the simple difference between right and wrong. Elena was suffering because of her connection to him, and his silence made him complicit in her torture. Thomas looked across the square to where Elena hung, her face now flushed red from the blood flow, her breath coming in labored gasps. In that moment, he saw not just the woman he loved, but a symbol of every injustice he had ever witnessed and chosen to ignore. His comfortable position in society had been built on the silent acceptance of such cruelties, and he could no longer bear the weight of that complicity. "You're right," he told Mary. his voice growing stronger with each word. "I've been a coward, but not anymore." Thomas strode across the square with purpose, his tall frame cutting through the crowd like a ship through troubled waters. Conversation stopped as people noticed his approach, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Sheriff Caldwell looked up from his conversation with the local magistrate, his eyes narrowing as he saw Thomas heading directly for the wooden frame. "Thomas Blackwood, you step back from there right now," Sheriff Caldwell commanded, his voice carrying all the authority of his position. "This woman has been judged by law and is serving her punishment. You have no business interfering." Thomas stopped directly in front of the sheriff, meeting his gaze with newfound confidence. "Sheriff Caldwell, with all due respect, this is not justice. This is cruelty disguised as law, prejudice dressed up as righteousness. I cannot and will not stand by while an innocent woman suffers." The crowd had grown silent, sensing the drama unfolding before them. Mrs. Caldwell pushed through the gathered people, her face twisted with fury. "How dare you defend this witch? She has corrupted you with her foreign ways, just as we said. You prove our point with your very words." Thomas turned to address not just Mrs. Caldwell, but the entire crowd. His voice rang clear and strong across the square. "Elena Moreau is no witch. She is a seamstress, a reader of books, a woman who has shown me more kindness and intelligence than I have found in all the so-called proper society of this town. If loving her makes me corrupted, then I embrace that corruption." A gasp ran through the crowd. Such a public declaration was unthinkable, a complete rejection of everything the town's social order stood for. Thomas could see the shock and outrage on face after face, but he also saw something else in a few expressions. A flicker of doubt, a moment of recognition that perhaps they had gone too far. Without waiting for permission or approval, Thomas moved to the rope that held Elena suspended. His hands worked quickly to untie the complex knots, years of sailing experience serving him well. The sheriff stepped forward to stop him, but Thomas's friend and fellow sailor, James Morrison, suddenly appeared beside him. "I'll help you with those ropes," James said quietly, his weathered hands joining Thomas's efforts. James had sailed with Thomas on merchant ships, and he had seen enough of the world to know that goodness came in many colors, and that love recognized no boundaries of race or creed. Other voices began to rise from the crowd, not all of them hostile. Mrs. Sarah Fletcher, the schoolteacher, stepped forward. "Perhaps we should listen to what Thomas has to say," she called out, her voice carrying the authority of education and reason. "This punishment seems excessive." Dr. William Hayes, who had been standing silently in the crowd, moved closer to the wooden frame. "From a medical standpoint," he announced, "hanging someone upside down for an extended period can cause serious harm or death. Surely our justice system doesn't require such extreme measures." The rope finally gave way under Thomas and James's efforts, and Elena collapsed into Thomas's waiting arms. Her face was deeply flushed, her breathing rapid and shallow from the ordeal. Thomas held her gently, feeling her weight against his chest, grateful beyond measure that she was still conscious. Sheriff Caldwell stepped forward, his hand moving toward his weapon. "Thomas Blackwood, you are interfering with the execution of legal justice. I order you to step away from that woman immediately." Thomas looked up at the sheriff, Elena still cradled in his arms. "No, Sheriff, I will not step away. In fact, I have something to declare before this entire town." He paused, looking around at the faces surrounding them, some curious, some angry, some confused. "I, Thomas Blackwood, take Elena Moreau as my wife before all of you as witnesses. Not in some secret ceremony, not hidden away in shame, but here, now, publicly and proudly. She is my wife, and I am her husband, and anyone who wishes to harm her will have to go through me first." The declaration sent shockwaves through the crowd. Marriage, even a declaration of marriage, carried legal weight in their society. A wife had certain protections under law that an unmarried woman did not, and a husband had the right to defend his wife against unjust persecution. Elena, still weak from her ordeal, looked up at Thomas with tears streaming down her face. Not tears of pain this time, but tears of gratitude and love. She had never imagined that he would risk everything for her, that he would choose love over comfort, justice over safety. "Do you accept me as your husband, Elena?" Thomas asked softly, his voice carrying across the now silent square. Elena's voice was weak but clear as she answered, "Yes, Thomas. I accept you as my husband, and I take you as mine." The crowd erupted in chaos as the implications of what had just occurred began to sink in. Some shouted in outrage, others in confusion, and a few in what might have been approval. But Thomas heard none of it. He was focused entirely on Elena, on helping her recover from her ordeal, on beginning the new life they would build together despite all the obstacles that lay ahead. The aftermath of Thomas's dramatic declaration rippled through Millbrook like stones thrown into still water. As Elena recovered her strength in Thomas's arms, the crowd around them slowly began to disperse, but not without heated discussions about what they had witnessed. The town had expected to see a witch punished and a lesson taught. Instead, they had witnessed a public challenge to their most fundamental beliefs about race, love, and justice. Sheriff Caldwell found himself in an impossible position. The law was clear about married women's rights, even when that marriage was declared rather than formally performed in a church. A husband had the legal authority to protect his wife, and Thomas's public claim created a legal gray area that the sheriff was not prepared to navigate. Moreover, several respected members of the community had spoken in favor of ending Elena's punishment, making any further action politically dangerous. Dr. Hayes approached the couple, his medical bag in hand. "Let me examine her," he said quietly to Thomas. "The blood flow to her head needs to be monitored, and she may need treatment for any injuries sustained during the hanging." As Dr. Hayes checked Elena's condition, Mrs. Fletcher gathered the courage to approach Thomas directly. "Mr. Blackwood," she said formally, "I want you to know that not everyone in this town agrees with what happened here today. Some of us believe that justice should be blind to the color of one's skin." Her words carried weight, because everyone knew Mrs. Fletcher as a woman of education and moral standing. If she was publicly supporting Thomas and Elena, it suggested that the couple might find more allies than enemies in their fight for acceptance. Thomas's father, Judge William Blackwood, arrived at the square just as Dr. Hayes was finishing his examination of Elena. The judge was a tall, imposing man whose opinion carried enormous influence in the community. His reaction to his son's actions would determine much about the couple's future in Millbrook. "Thomas," Judge Blackwood said, his voice carefully controlled, "I think we need to have a private conversation. Bring your wife to our home. We have much to discuss." The walk to the Blackwood mansion was tense and silent. Elena, still weak from her ordeal, leaned heavily on Thomas's arm as they made their way through streets lined with curious onlookers. Some windows had curtains hastily drawn as they passed, while others revealed faces pressed against the glass, eager to witness this unprecedented drama unfolding in their quiet town. Mary Blackwood had run ahead to prepare a room for Elena, defying her parents' instructions to stay away from the situation. When Thomas and Elena arrived at the grand White House with its pillared porch, Mary was waiting with warm water, clean clothes, and a determination to help that reminded Thomas why he loved his sister so deeply. Judge Blackwood led Thomas into his study, while Elena rested under Mary's care. The room was lined with law books and portraits of distinguished ancestors, symbols of the family's long-standing position in Virginia society. The weight of tradition and expectation hung heavy in the air as father and son faced each other across the mahogany desk. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Judge Blackwood asked, his voice heavy with disappointment. "You've thrown away everything our family has built for generations. Our reputation, our standing in the community, our political influence, all of it is now in jeopardy because you chose to publicly defend a woman of questionable parentage." Thomas met his father's gaze steadily. "I saved an innocent woman from torture and claimed her as my wife because I love her. If that destroys our family's reputation, then perhaps our reputation was built on things that deserved to be destroyed." The judge was quiet for a long moment, studying his son's face. Thomas had always been strong-willed, but this was different. This was a man who had found his moral center and would not be moved from it, regardless of the consequences. "You realize," Judge Blackwood said finally, "that if you remain in Millbrook, life will be very difficult. There will be constant opposition, social isolation, possibly even danger." "Is this woman worth such a price?" Thomas's answer came without hesitation. "Elena is worth any price. But more than that, Father, this is about who I choose to be as a man. I can no longer live in a society that treats human beings as less than human based on the circumstances of their birth. If standing against that means losing everything else, then so be it." Judge Blackwood walked to his window and looked out at the town he had helped shape with his legal decisions and political influence. After several minutes of silence, he turned back to his son with an expression that Thomas couldn't quite read. "There is a way," the judge said slowly, "that this situation might be resolved to everyone's benefit. I have been corresponding with colleagues in Philadelphia about establishing a new law practice there. The city is more progressive in its attitudes toward mixed marriages and racial tolerance. You and Elena could start fresh there, with my financial support and legal connections to help establish yourselves." Thomas felt a surge of hope mixed with surprise. "You would help us?" "I disagree with your choice," Judge Blackwood admitted, "but I respect the courage it took to make it. More importantly, I love my son enough to want him to have a chance at happiness, even if that happiness looks different from what I had planned for him." That evening, the Blackwood family gathered for what would be their last dinner together in Millbrook. Elena, now recovered enough to join them, sat beside Thomas at the polished dining table. The conversation was awkward at first, but gradually warmed as Mary's enthusiasm and Thomas's obvious happiness began to influence the mood. Elena spoke little during the meal, but when she did, her intelligence and grace gradually won over even Thomas's initially skeptical mother. By the end of the evening, Mrs. Blackwood was asking Elena about her sewing skills and wondering aloud if there might be opportunities for a skilled seamstress in Philadelphia. The decision was made to leave Millbrook within the week. Judge Blackwood would use his influence to ensure that no legal charges were filed against Thomas for his interference with Elena's punishment, while Sheriff Caldwell seemed only too happy to see the controversial couple leave his jurisdiction. On their last morning in town, Thomas and Elena walked hand in hand to the small cemetery where Elena's parents were buried. She knelt beside their simple graves and spoke softly in a mixture of English and Spanish, telling them about Thomas and asking for their blessing on the journey ahead. They would have liked him, Elena told Thomas as they prepared to leave. Papa always said that a man's character was more important than his bloodline, and Mama believed that love could overcome any obstacle if it was strong enough. The wagon that would carry them to their new life was loaded with Elena's few possessions, some of Thomas's books, and supplies provided by Judge Blackwood for their journey. As they prepared to leave, several people came to wish them well, including Dr. Hayes, Mrs. Fletcher, and James Morrison. "You've given us something to think about," Mrs. Fletcher told them quietly. Perhaps some of us will remember this day and find the courage to stand up for what's right when the next opportunity comes. As their wagon rolled out of Millbrook, Thomas and Elena looked back at the town that had brought them together and nearly torn them apart. The wooden frame still stood in the square, a reminder of the cruelty they were leaving behind, but also of the courage that had overcome it. Elena leaned against Thomas's shoulder as the familiar buildings gave way to open countryside. "Are you sorry?" she asked. "About leaving everything you've known?" Thomas considered the question seriously. Behind them lay comfort, security, and the approval of a society built on injustice. Ahead lay uncertainty, challenge, and the need to build a new life from nothing. But beside him sat the woman he loved, free from the threat of persecution, ready to face whatever came next, as his partner and equal. "No," he said finally, his arm tightening around her. "I'm not sorry at all. We're going to build something better, Elena. Something based on love instead of fear, on justice instead of prejudice. It won't be easy, but it will be ours." The wagon continued down the dusty road toward Philadelphia, carrying two people who had chosen love over convention, courage over comfort, and hope over fear. Behind them, Millbrook slowly disappeared into the distance, while ahead lay a future where they could write their own story of what it meant to be family, regardless of the color of their skin or the prejudices of the past. Their declaration of marriage in that town square had been more than just a rescue from immediate danger. It had been a declaration of faith in a better world, one where love could triumph over hatred and where two people could stand together against any storm that might come their way.